What's cracking, guys? Your boy Daniel DeBrocke here, and today I'm going to be talking about how to break through a strength plateau. Now, the main objectives of this video are as follows. First, I'm going to actually highlight the primary causes of a plateau, and then we're going to offer some practical recommendations to actually break through this strength plateau so you can start seeing better results and hitting some new PRs. Now, what are the primary causes of a strength plateau? Now, these are in no particular order, although I will highlight a couple of them as being probably upwards, up at the top in terms of priority and things that you need to definitely check off. So the first one is insufficient intensity of effort. This is an incredibly important one, and any time that I see one of my own lifters who seems to be kind of stagnating or they're not experiencing results in the same way that they used to, the first thing that I do is I start asking for more videos. I say, hey, I want to see your accessories. I want to see your auxiliary movements. I want to see all of that stuff because I'm a remote coach. And so all of my athletes are international, or most of them are international. So, I'm always working on their technique in terms of their primary lifts and secondary lifts, but a lot of the times, unless there's actually an issue, I'm not going to ask them to send me their split squats or their pull-ups or pen lay rows or whatever it might be. But if we're seeing some stagnation or even a slowing down of progress, I will absolutely ask for those. And very, very often what I see is that these individuals have kind of pulled back the intensity a little bit. They might push really, really hard in their main lifts, but then they kind of get a little bit tired and so they're not as motivated. And they're like, I don't really like Bulgarian split squats, so I'm just going to kind of do this. Yeah, it's still hard, but I'm not going to really push it. I've seen individuals, there's one example in particular where I had a female lifter. She's very, very strong, but she's small, right? So her body weight's very low, but she's very, very strong. And she was doing Bulgarian split squats with, I believe, 50-pound dumbbells, right? Which is still quite a lot for someone her size. However, when I was looking at those videos, I was like, nah, that's not it. So I actually made her increase the dumbbells to, I believe, 80 pounds. And she was still able to perform all of her reps and she was dying. But that was the intensity that I prescribed. And when I'm looking at her program, that's the intensity of effort that I thought was being brought to the table, but it wasn't, right? And now here's the thing. I'm not taking a jab at this one particular client because this happens to everyone, including myself. This is more common in novices and intermediates than it is advanced athletes, because usually advanced athletes are obviously very experienced and very, very likely have been doing it for a very long time and therefore are able to kind of push themselves through even if they don't necessarily want to. The next thing that we look at is technical limitations. So again, we have to remember that strength is predicated on your ability to actually express it within a given movement. So it's not enough to just be very strong. You have to be able to express that strength through a squat, bench, deadlift, or if you're not a power lifter, through whatever other means that you would like. Now, I'm just going to stick to powerlifting to make things, a little bit simpler. So for instance, if your quads are really strong and your hips are really strong and your back is really strong, your core, everything is really strong, but you're not able to brace effectively, you just can't coordinate that the bracing mechanics effectively, well, man, that's a huge limitation because now there's a possibility that your hips are going to shift, you might fold, you might get out of position, and now you're not going to be as rigid, and therefore you're going to have power leakages that aren't basically being transferred back up into the bar. So you can substantially limit your ability to actually express strength, which means you're going to reduce the total load on the bar. Now, not only is this important from a competitive standpoint when you're on the platform, but it's also important from the standpoint of training and development, because if you're constantly, not getting a sufficient stimulus, even if it feels very hard, you might not be getting a sufficient stimulus to really drive adaptations because technically you can move more. It's just because of a technical limitation that you're actually not able to express that strength through proper motor mechanics. So technique is a very, very important one as well. The next one that we can look at is insufficient volume and intensity. A lot of people just don't train very hard. They don't do enough intensity. They don't do enough volume. You want to be making sure that you are lifting at a high enough intensity to stimulate some sort of adaptive response relative to whatever it is that you're trying to develop. In this case, that would be strength. You also need to make sure that you have sufficient intensity. It's not enough to just go in and do a bunch of singles. You need to make sure that you've got enough volume to both build and preserve muscle that you already have, but then also to drive additional strength characteristics. Okay, so we need to make sure that we have sufficient amounts of volume and intensity. The next is actually too much volume intensity, and this is kind of common. So some examples of this are maxing out, or, like doing the Bulgarian system. A lot of people were doing that for a little while. Or if you're doing like 10 by 10s or something crazy like that, like this is just way too much for the vast majority of people. I'm not saying that it can't work. I'm just saying that as a general rule, it's probably not a good idea to be maxing out every single session or every other session. So you want to make sure that you have a reasonable amount of volume and intensity in your program, and you have an effective way of actually troubleshooting what that might be. The next thing is low specificity. So you might be getting crazy strong in one particular lift, but then you go back to the main lift and you realize that it has absolutely zero dynamic correspondence. And this is really important. So for instance, good mornings are a great exercise. Stiff leg deadlifts are a great exercise. RDLs are a great exercise, but they don't always have the exact same carryover for each individual. Every individual is going to be unique in terms of their strengths, their weaknesses, their individual leverages, their level of experience, and basically what they're able to get from each exercise. So you might be doing a good morning because, person X says, hey, good morning is going to help you build your deadlift. But then you get really strong in the good morning and you go back to doing your deadlifts, or you're doing both simultaneously and you just find it doesn't really have any carryover. That's pretty important, right? You need to make sure you're not wasting any energy or adaptive reserves on exercises that don't necessarily translate. So you want to make sure that, not only exercise selection is dialed in, but also the intensity is dialed in. If you're doing squats, low bar squat, that's super specific, right? If you're doing it in your competition gear and you're doing it for singles, it's very specific. But what if you're only doing it at 50 or 60%? Well, that's not high enough of intensity, right? So we need to make sure we've got specificity in terms of exercise selection, in terms of frequency, how often you're doing it, in terms of volume, intensity. All these things need to drive specificity and enhance your ability to execute the competition style lifts or whatever particular lifts you're trying to get strong at. The next is going to be insufficient recovery. So we're looking at things like poor sleep. Insufficient caloric intake is a huge one. Low protein intake, low carb or no carb, like a ketogenic based diet, poor hydration, excess stress, a lot of these lifestyle variables that can really impact your ability to recover and therefore actually adapt to the training stimulus that you're presenting through your workouts. The next that we can look at is training staleness. So I've definitely run into instances where I've been training athletes, they've been seeing great progress week over week, month over month, but then they just kind of get disengaged. And this actually relates very closely to the first example that I gave about low intensity of effort. If people are kind of disengaged, if they're not really enjoying their training, if they're like, oh, fuck, like I know I'm getting better, but it's just really boring doing the exact same thing over and over and over, that very well may actually decrease their motivation to push as hard as they should be in their training, which can actually lead to a plateau. So training staleness is something important to keep in mind when you're considering how to alter your program. You want to make sure they're highly engaged, they're enjoying the program, but also they are getting results, because at the end of the day, training is supposed to be fun, but ultimately it's supposed to drive adaptations as well. Next, we look at training frequency. So are you training frequently enough? Like, let's say you've developed a workout and you're checking off all the boxes. It's a perfectly designed workout, very, very specific, perfect amount of volume, exercise selection is great, but you're only doing it once a week. Are you really going to get that much stronger? Man, that's going to be hard. Certainly not if you're advanced. I would really struggle to think that. So we need to make sure that we have a sufficient amount of frequency, but also not too high frequency. So, for instance, if you're a smaller lifter, let's say like a 60 kilogram female, you could probably handle training 5 or 6 days a week and have a pretty high frequency in terms of, how often you're doing each particular lift. Whereas if you're, a 300-pound lifter, man, it's probably going to be pretty hard to do a high frequency, SBD program training 6 days a week or something like that. So you need to make sure that your training frequency is aligned with all the other variables that we're looking at. Like, I just mentioned a couple in terms of gender, body weight, and experience and things like that. So that's all important to keep in mind. Another one is exercise selection. So I kind of touched on this earlier when we talked about specificity, but exercise selection is really important. Just because an exercise has high carryover for one individual doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have the same carryover for others. It's also really important to understand that you need to be executing the exercise in a particular way in order for it to have that purported carryover. So for instance, I find front squats have a massive carryover to my low bar squat. I find they strengthen the crap out of my quads, my core bracing is fantastic, and because I have to really keep that extension in my upper back, when I go and switch back to low bar, it's super easy carrying any amount of weight on my back. I could walk out, 115%, and it would still actually not feel that heavy on my back, just because I'm so used to carrying very heavy loads in a front rack position, because my front squat's quite big. So exercise selection, we need to make sure that it actually translates and has some sort of dynamic correspondence to what it is that you're trying to do. Again, doing lunges is not going to make you stronger at squatting if you're an advanced athlete. Doing dumbbell flies is not going to make you stronger if you're an advanced athlete. So you need to make sure that just because, this exercise happens to train similar things, it needs to also actually check off the box of translating to the primary lifts that you're trying to develop. Now, what are some practical recommendations to counter some of these very common reasons for stagnation in your training and hitting those plateaus? Well, the first thing that you can do is work with a coach. That's going to be pretty straightforward. They're going to make sure that they can actually keep you on track, make sure that your intensity of effort is really high. Now, if you don't have a coach, or you don't really want to work with a coach, or you don't have the funds, or whatever it might be, that's perfectly fine. Ask your training partners, record your videos, evaluate yourself, and be honest and say, hey, you know what? When I'm looking at this squat, or when I'm looking at this set of leg press, or dumbbell press, or pull-ups, or whatever it might be, is that really a 2 RIR or a 3 RIR or whatever's prescribed? Or am I kind of sandbagging it? And then you can make sure that, basically you just increase the intensity, you increase the effort. And you might not go from 0 to 100, but you might notice that week after week you start pushing harder and harder and harder. And that's the kind of momentum that we want to build over time anyways. So that's going to be a really effective means of doing that. Recording yourself lifting is very, very effective. Next, you want to ensure that you're actually enjoying the process, right? So I mentioned earlier, if you're training stale, if you don't really enjoy it, if you're like, oh man, I hate doing this exercise, it hurts my shoulder, or, you don't enjoy it, it's not fun, you're going to kind of start to slack off. You're going to become disengaged and you're not going to want to train, right? It's going to be harder to motivate yourself to get into the gym. So do things that you like that also have a high correspondence to your actual goals. And that's ultimately not that hard. So we have to make sure that we're doing that and you're enjoying the process. Ultimately, if you're not having fun, why the fuck are you even doing it? You're not going to get paid a ton of money being a strength athlete anyway, so ultimately it should just kind of be about enjoyment primarily. Next, we want to make sure that we're maintaining a sufficient level of intensity or exposure to high enough intensities. So most of your strength gains are going to be developed at 85+% of your 1 rep max. Now, does this mean you need to be doing that every single day? No, it doesn't. But you need to make sure that you have sufficient exposure to high enough intensities at a frequency that's going to allow you to adapt and progress, but not at a frequency that's going to be too much and make you be incapable of recovering. So it's kind of a fine balance, but you need to make sure that you're striking that balance between having enough exposure to high intensities at an appropriate frequency to get the best results. Next, you want to think about managing your lifestyle, right? So if your sleep, your nutrition, your hydration, all that stuff sucks, that's going to really set you back. A 10%, what is it? Like a 1% hydration or 1% dehydration can reduce your strength by 10%. If you're dehydrated by about 3 to 4%, that can result in up to a 30% reduction, 30 to 40% reduction, in work capacity. So these are very, very significant things. If you're not getting enough protein in, man, your muscles aren't going to recover. You're going to be sore. You're not going to be getting the strength gains you want. So you need to make sure your sleep, your nutrition, your hydration, all of that stuff is dialed in, as well as your stress management. Stress is an absolute killer, and you have to make sure that you're managing your stress to make sure that you can recover effectively. Next, we want to look at refining your technique. So videos can also be very helpful for that, right? If you're looking at your videos to evaluate how much intensity you're putting into them, you can absolutely also look at your technique at the exact same time. Are you flaring your rib cage during a squat? Are your elbows, really wobbly, and does your shoulder seem unstable when you're doing a bench press? Is your back rounding a ton when you're deadlifting? Or are you keeping a very solid position? So these are things you can evaluate on your own with your video, as well as if you have a training partner or if you have a coach. Then we want to ensure the frequency is sufficient to elicit a strength and technical development. So again, technique development requires higher levels of frequency. Strength requires a little bit less, because if we're hitting super, super heavy, again, that's going to create greater recovery requirements. So we need to make sure that we're doing it at enough frequency that we're getting sufficient strength stimulus, but we're also getting enough exposure to the lifts themselves so we can get good technical practice in. And that's really important. Then we want to select exercises that have a high dynamic correspondence to competition lifts. And this is going to be something that you're going to experiment with. Now, there's really great rules of thumb that you can look at. And I've got actually a whole video on how to build your own strength block, how to select the appropriate volumes, how to select the right exercises, how to adjust things, how to do deload. Like, all of this stuff is in a video that I posted previously. So I'll make sure I link that up as well, and you guys can check that out. But you want to make sure that you have exercises that correspond well to what you're actually doing. And one thing that's really undervalued is reviewing your actual program, right? So every single week, set up a weekly review process. You can you can just kind of look and say, like, hey, am I stressed out this week? How stressed was I? Did I get good sleep? What was my average hydration this week? What were my macros at, if you're tracking your macros? How did I perform? And just kind of look and notice trends, and then make basically adjustments to your program according to all of that information. So if you're always run down, if you're always beat up and you're not seeing progress and you're miserable, you're probably doing too much, or you're not recovering, right? So there could be a variety of different things, but you'll be able to very easily see what those things might be and identify potential areas of opportunity for growth by actually logging how things have been going on a week-by-week basis. So thank you so much for watching, guys. And if you got something valuable from this video, consider subscribing to support the channel. Thanks so much for watching again, and I'll see you later.